So could Jesus walk on water? Among the important mysteries of Christ's life, few are as overlooked in theology as his walking on water. Perhaps because this exceptional action seems to distance him from other human beings while not benefiting anyone. Our contribution aims to help remedy this oversight. It is structured according to 5 questions. Could he? Should he have? Could he do it himself? How could he do it? And could he do it himself as man? Somewhat after the manner of Joseph Ratzinger in his work, Jesus of Nazareth, we will engage current biblical scholarship on the parallel gospel passages in Mark, Matthew, and John, because it collectively offers significant theological elements, many of which are absent in St. Thomas's teaching. At the same time, we will root our study on the latter in order to discover and explain the connection between Jesus' walk on water and the other mysteries. So, number 1, could he walk on water? Biblical scholars make the case that a careful reading of the gospel text discards rationalistic solutions that attempt to downplay the exceptional character of a human being walking on the surface of the Sea of Galilee. For instance, so here's the first question, and I should have shown you all of these before. There we go. So here's the gospel, the pericope according to Mark, which is the one I'm going to be referring to most. The bid to render the description of Jesus' action containing the preposition epi in Greek, so that's Mark 6:48, generally signifying on, upon, and over, as Jesus walking by or beside the sea. So this is contradicted by the same preposition's employment in the verse that precedes it, where Jesus is said to be alone on land. Or again, had there been big enough floating patches of ice, Jesus could have surfed on amid the waves, originating in underwater salty springs in combination with a temperature drop, a phenomenon that has only been theorized but never observed. Surely at least one of the 3 detailed gospel accounts would have mentioned it. In that scenario, the gospel would actually be misleading, since Jesus would not have been walking on water, but gliding on ice. Hypotheses such as these, whose main interpretative principle is the exclusion of the supernatural, presuppose that the text itself is of secondary importance and can be treated as an empty husk that requires corrections and additions by savants who know more than the primitive authors of the Gospels. The text, as we have received it, would either be non-historical, such as a misplaced apparition of the risen Lord, or a story made up by the Christian community for pedagogical reasons, or a misrepresentation of the facts owing to, for example, a collective hallucination of the disciples, or the projection of a hologram, or an ethereal double by Jesus. So all of these theories have people behind them. Moreover, if the occurrence must be mundane, then one cannot rule out that Jesus himself wished to deceive his disciples, albeit with good intentions, by walking next to the shore or on a hypothetical shallow bank, wading in the surf, or, why not, turning to some prop, such as standing on a trained fish, employing buoyant footwear, or hiring someone to place some barely visible stepping stones ahead of time. Now, these imaginative solutions fly in the face of the central tenet of Christ's ministry. He has come to reveal the truth and testify to it. The possibility of an immaterial manifestation of Jesus is brought up by the disciples themselves, who think he is a ghost. The text shoots this down when the Lord addresses them and ultimately joins them on their journey. So coming back to our initial question, could Jesus walk on water? The answer is no. Jesus could not walk on water as man. The gospel text does not admit another solution than a divine cause. We next ask, should he have walked on water? This is a question about the fittingness of this event of Christ's life, which is the question upon which St. Thomas's soteriology in the Tertia Pars is based. Let's see if this works. Should Jesus have walked on water? As Gulich remarks, these are all exegetes. I'm not familiar with all of them, but I'll mention them anyway. Those who try to explain away the miraculous nature of the walking on the sea miss the epiphanic character of the story. The passage is chock full of biblical epiphanic marks, or elements that characterize an epiphany. A precise time reference, the reaction of fear on the part of the witnesses, the word of encouragement and or the command not to fear, and a self-revelation formula when the identity of the one who appears is not already known. Some scholars also propose that Mark's comment that Jesus came to them walking on the sea and wanted to pass by them, is almost a technical term for a divine epiphany in the Septuagint, since it is employed when God encounters both Moses and Elijah. Even though all of what Christ did and experienced reveals the truth about God and man to us, this event holds a special place for the God-man. Aside from the Paschal mystery itself, few, if any, other events are as prepared and deliberate as this one. Thus, according to Mark and Matthew, Jesus compels the apostles to board the boat while he stays on land. This implies that all that follows is in obedience to him, as Davies remarks. Moreover, St. Thomas declares that Christ's command is the occasion for the disciples to be exposed to the ensuing perceived danger on the sea, from which Jesus plans to save them. In this regard, Mark reminds us that Jesus is fully aware of what is happening on the sea by adding that he saw them from afar while on the mountain. More significantly, Mark and Matthew say that Christ prays immediately before walking on the water. Matthew only expressly mentions Jesus as praying here and at Gethsemane, and Mark only adds one other occurrence in which Jesus prays also before dawn after an intense day of preaching and healing and prior to heading somewhere else. Clearly, the reference to Jesus praying signals that something remarkable is about to happen. Both Gospels attest that Jesus had originally taken his disciples to a lonely place, and he goes back to such a place to pray alone. As Turner points out, this was likely Jesus' original goal, but he was hindered by the crowds. Finally, alone, he prays on into the night. Another biblical tell of an encounter with God is the mountain. Abraham, Moriah, Moses, Sinai, and Elijah Horeb all witnessed theophanies upon a mountain. In our case, all three parallel pericopes call our attention to Christ being on a mountain before he walked on water. In particular, John also mentions it before the feeding of the multitude, and could even imply that Jesus returns to the same mountain. Notably, all these verses employ the definite article. This is not just a mountain, but the mountain. Moreover, Jesus' location atop a mountain in the gospel is never banal. In John, he only goes to one other mountain, the Mount of Olives. While in Mark, he goes to four, the one where he institutes the apostles, the one at hand, the one where the transfiguration takes place, and the Mount of Olives. Matthew, who seems to use mountains as milestones of Jesus' journey, speaks of 7, while Luke speaks of 5. For the Gospels, when Jesus climbs atop a mountain, he is preparing the revelation of a momentous teaching and or action. We can also note that Jesus coming down from the mountain, in the present case, is reminiscent of Moses' own descent from Mount Sinai after meeting the Lord and writing the tablets of the law, which occurred shortly after two miracles that are akin to the two we are dwelling on now, the miraculous crossing of the Red Sea and the miraculous bread called manna. Some biblical scholars have been stumped by a mutually exclusive choice between an epiphany and a rescue event. Scripture, however, witnesses that God chooses to reveal himself when in the act of saving his children. For instance, when he reveals both his name and his plan to free his people to Moses in the burning bush, or when he effectively frees his people by opening the Red Sea for them and revealing his glory to them. Mark's comment that Jesus meant to pass by the boat suggests that this was not primarily a rescue mission. In fact, according to Mark and John, the duress the disciples were under was either limited to the wind being against them or to the sea rising because the wind was blowing. Ulrich goes as far as proposing that Mark's passage may be read as implying that the disciples' progress was restrained by divine power in order that Jesus might be manifested to them in a way that revealed his role as a divine Messiah. A greater case can be made for the presence of actual danger in the Matthew account, since it mentions that the boat was tormented by the waves. St. Thomas sees it that way, while Ulrich acknowledges that water, storm, and night are biblical symbols of distress, fear, and death. Irrespective of the degree of peril involved, Stein remarks that the abating of the wind when Jesus joins them shows that the miracle rescue dimension of the account is integral to the story. In truth, the fact that they had already witnessed Jesus calming an actual storm on the sea allows the disciples to recognize his power at work here, even though he does not address the wind. As Ulrich puts it, the close link between the abating of the wind and Jesus' stepping into the boat makes clear to the disciples that the wind was directly controlled by a divine force. If the wind did not pose such a great threat to the grizzled fishermen, one could argue that what truly distressed them was Jesus' own coming on the waters. Jesus thus saves them from himself, or rather from their impression of himself. Additionally, in Matthew, Peter is also saved from sinking, and in John, the boat is brought to shore. Finally, this event is inextricably connected with the feeding of the 5,000, which immediately precedes the walking on the sea in all three accounts. Together, they constitute the only signs John shares with the synoptics. Luke, of course, narrates the feeding, but not the tandem. As many scholars point out, in all likelihood, this combination precedes the Markian tradition. The cohesion of this diptych is cemented by the employment of the boat to voyage on the Sea of Galilee before the multiplication of the loaves, and the reappearance of a crowd after Jesus walks on water. In both cases, the faith of the disciples is put to the test when Christ involves them in what he is doing or about to do. Together, they fulfill what the water signs and miraculous feedings at the time of Moses, manna and crossing the Red Sea, and Elisha, crossing the Jordan and multiplying loaves, had prefigured. However, if, as John attests, this was not lost on the crowd who proclaims this is truly the prophet who is to come into the world, why was another sign needed immediately after the feeding of the multitude? We will parse this question into the three we mentioned at the beginning. So questions 3, 4, and 5. Could he walk on water himself? Could he do it? How could he do it? And could he do it himself as man? At each stage, our response will refer to a way in which Jesus saves us. Through his twofold illumination, his twofold exemplarity, and his instrumental causality. Could he walk on water on his own or in any way? Just to be clear, the previous point was, should he have walked on water? And so the epiphany is the reason why he should have walked on water. He had to manifest something, and that's what we're going to see in these last three questions. Jesus wishes to drive home the very need for revelation. Mark ends his account of this episode by noting that the disciples were utterly beyond themselves, for they did not understand about the loaves of bread. Rather, their hearts were petrified or hardened. In attributing hardened hearts to the disciples, Mark describes them in the same way he had described Jesus' adversaries. John and the Pauline corpus also employ the expression. The next time Jesus asks them whether their hearts are turned to stone, he will warn them of the leaven of Herod and the Pharisees and rebuke them for still failing to understand the meaning of not one, but two miraculous multiplications of loaves. The petrified heart is an expression akin to the one applied to Pharaoh, whose weighed down heart also refused to acknowledge the work of God despite the many signs he worked in Egypt. In Ezekiel, God twice announces that he will remove the petrified heart of his people when he establishes the new covenant. Against this backdrop, the implication in Mark is that the disciples require divine assistance to change their hearts and believe. This need equates them with the unbelievers. By permitting the disciples' lack of understanding as a group in the face of such a cumulus of miracles, God proves a point in the most obvious way possible. An interior illumination is needed to believe God. Their difficulties believing are not primarily culpable, but a device of divine pedagogy. Human beings cannot grasp even the most evident and powerful signs without a supernatural elevation of their intellect. So there's a twofold illumination, the interior and the exterior. In Matthew, being in need of an interior illumination is exemplified in the person of Peter. He appears both as a believer who asks the Lord to command him to walk on water, and as a man of little faith who falters when he lets himself be overwhelmed by the situation. As Hagner puts it, Peter is here paradoxically a model both of faith and of lack of faith. He will embody this contradiction again in chapter 16, when in the span of less than 10 verses, Jesus commends his God-given faith and rejects him as an adversary, Satan, of the mind of God. St. Thomas recaps the incident as follows. But why did he let him be in danger? First, he commanded him to go to show his power, because both walked and the disciples saw this. But that he permitted Peter to sink was so he would find out what he could do on his own. Jesus' purpose in this life is not only to cause faith in his disciples, but also to show them that they need it. Without it, all his signs and actions, including his passion and resurrection, are for naught. In other words, as St. Thomas is fond of saying, Christ illuminates both exteriorly and interiorly, because one illumination cannot stand without the other. Following Vatican II's teaching, we can say that Christ's words when walking on water clarify what this deed means, while the deed manifests and confirms those words. The three Gospels concur in taking down Jesus' words as, "Take heart, ego eimi," while Mark and Matthew tack on the epiphanic "fear not" at the end. Clearly, the reason for encouragement and casting out fear is found in the two words the latter two evangelists, Mark and Matthew, placed in the middle of the phrase. On the one hand, set in this context, these words can be correctly interpreted to be a self-identification formula. It is I, which allays the disciples' fear of him being a ghost. On the other hand, Gulich points out that as the concluding story of the miracle collection in Mark, it provides the answer to the "who is this?" question posed by the disciples after Jesus stills the storm in the opening story of the collection. Thus, the rendering "I am," which references the divine name revealed in Exodus 3, is also valid. Indeed, most exegetes today admit that the text is multidimensional. When they hear these words, the disciples identify the man Jesus they have come to know and love, and at the same time recognize the hallowed name of the Lord. St. Thomas teaches the same. I'm omitting his text on account of our time. As Ratzinger adverts, the latter is also suggested by the reaction of the disciples, the name "I am," whose fear did not vanish when they heard these words and recognized Christ, but was rather recast into a theophanic fear. The outcome in Matthew is even more astonishing. There, in a scene whose significance is widely underrated in theology, the apostles adore Jesus by prostrating themselves before him and saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." According to Matthew, this is the only occasion before the resurrection in which the disciples worship Jesus. They will only do so again at the very end of the gospel. In light of the words spoken on the boat, Peter's own confession in Caesarea Philippi, in chapter 16, is the resumption and intensification of this confession by all the disciples. It is crucial that the disciples know that Jesus is true man and could not walk on water, so that they acknowledge that God's power was at work in him. Astonishingly, Jesus far surpasses this inference by taking on the very name of the Lord. Jesus could not walk on water as man, but he still had the power to do so as God. Given that this revelation exceeds their capacity, it would have made little sense for him, for Jesus, to perform this deed and pronounce these words had he not also illuminated them from within, though in stages and at the opportune time. How could Jesus walk on water? The second thing Jesus reveals by walking on water is our ultimate end and our calling to attain it. John suggests this by indicating that as soon as the disciples were willing to take Jesus into the boat, it immediately arrived at their destination. Biblical scholars consider that this alludes to God's rescue of the distressed sailors in Psalm 107 or 106. Now it is Jesus who brings the disciples to their desired haven. Furthermore, Kostenberger opines, the boat's arrival at the shore at once may indicate a second miracle, in which case the walking on water would be followed by a miraculous landing. St. Thomas one-ups him by saying that because Jesus wished to work a greater miracle, he did not climb on board the boat. Thus, a threefold miracle converges here, to wit, the walking on the sea, the sudden ceasing of the storm, and the conducting of the distant boat to port. Following this line of convergence, we believe that Jesus' walking on water reveals something about the attainment of the goal of our journey, that is, the glory of heaven. In fact, drawing critically from a teaching of Hugh of St. Victor, St. Thomas explains that Christ does not perform a miracle upon the water, a nature miracle, as many or most exegetes describe it, but manifests in his humanity the sign, indicia, of one of the four qualities of the risen body called dotes. Rejecting Hugh of St. Victor's opinion, St. Thomas explains that because Christ did not possess these properties as his own during his earthly existence, since his body was not yet glorified, the act of these properties, not the properties themselves, were only given to him miraculously and in a transient manner. However, he never once bears the signs of all four dotes simultaneously, but rather receives them one at a time, thus revealing them in a way that does not undermine his passibility or his ability to suffer during his earthly existence. That his purpose while assuming them was to make them known to us is strongly suggested by the mostly non-utilitarian character of the events in which they appear. So there's four of them. Agility, or agilitas, when he walked on the waves of the sea. I'm quoting St. Thomas in the Tertia Pars when he's discussing the Transfiguration, question 45, article 1. Ad tertium. Then there's subtlety or subtilitas, when he came forth from the closed womb of the Virgin. Impassibility, impassibilitas, when he escaped unhurt from the hands of the Jews who wished to hurl him down or to stone him. And finally, he was transfigured on account of clarity, claritas. What he intended to reveal is explained repeatedly by St. Thomas when discussing Christ's transfiguration. I quote Thomas again. Same article, same question. In order that anyone go straight along a road, he must have some knowledge of the end. The final destination of man's life journey is the glory of the resurrection of the blessed. Given that the chief element of this glory is already found in the earthly Christ, insofar as he sees the divine essence qua man, the signs of the dotes he receives, although miraculous, transient, and not proper to him, are truly rooted in glory, albeit one whose overflow is economically withheld. As the Transfiguration shows a quality that is specific to the glorified body, not just clarity, can be called on to bear witness to glory, as well as to the definitive order of the universe at the end of time, when spiritual realities that enjoy full communion with God will hold preeminence over all bodies, and thus cooperate perfectly in the stewardship of creation. In his commentary on the sentences, St. Thomas teaches that on that day, the glorified body will be entirely subject to the glorified soul, not only so that there is nothing in it that resists the will of the Spirit, for that also was the case in Adam's body, but also such that there is in it a perfection or disposition that overflows from the glorified soul into the body, by which it is rendered apt for this subjection. And this perfection is called a dos, D-O-S, of the glorified body. End of quote. Thus, the glorified body is, this is also from the commentary on the sentences, an instrument that is most perfectly obedient to its principal agent. Having obtained the overflow of glory, the body, again quoting Thomas, will not move for the sake of obtaining perfect participation in divine goodness, but to demonstrate the power of the soul. To be clear, the soul as form of the body has utter dominion or domination over it, inasmuch as it serves God unwaveringly, immobiliter. Consequently, the more perfect the soul's charity and degree of glory is, the more perfect its body's dotes will be. Each of the dotes points to an aspect of the overflowing of glory from the soul to the body. A previous draft included an explanation of each one, but don't worry, we're only going to go to the one that applies to Jesus walking on water, which is agility or agilitas. It involves the perfect subjection of the body to the soul insofar as the soul moves it. Quoting the commentary on the sentences, by the gift of agility, the body is subject to the soul as its motor, namely, so that it is unencumbered and nimble, to obey the Spirit in all the movements and actions of the soul. According to this dos, the risen will move in heaven without labor and travel a great distance in little time, although their movements will not be instantaneous as those of angels who do not have a body. Additionally, those with glorious bodies will be able to move freely in the air, ascending with their own power. Of the four properties of the glorious bodies, it is the only one Jesus unequivocally bestows upon another wayfarer during his earthly life. In fact, whereas during his transfiguration he does not make Peter or the sons of thunder participate in claritas, here, when Jesus walks on water, he makes Peter walk on water as well, and even carries the boat to port. Through this sign of the glory of heaven, Christ reveals his exemplary causality. Now, not one the disciples can imitate, but one after which God will model their own glorious bodies at the resurrection. This type of exemplarity, which the late Jean-Pierre Torel coined ontological, reminds us that we do not only need someone to set a good example for us, what Torel called moral exemplarity, but also for someone to conform us to it. These two exemplarities work together, because God does not wish to save us without our cooperation. By walking on water, Jesus does not only show us what we will become in heaven, but also the effects of a transformation in this life we can cooperate with, namely, union with God. Lest a disciple believe he can attain this charity through his own power and devices, Jesus shows an aspect of that friendship far surpassing them. In fact, Peter's imitation of Christ on the surface of the sea involves less divine power and human involvement than his imitation of Christ's love. Still, the sheer splendor of the former helps us begin to understand how much is at stake in the latter. Having established how he could walk on water, or wherein lies the miracle, we now ask if he could cause this himself as man. Could Jesus walk on water on his own as man? Jesus' manifestation of agility as a property of the glorified body was miraculous. So was his causing of this quality in Peter, the stilling of the wind, and the rapid movement of the boat across the sea surface. St. Thomas ranks miracles according to the degree in which they surpass nature. Jesus' own agility and his extending it to Peter, I think, are of the first and highest degree because it is something nature cannot do in any way. The stilling of the wind is in the lowest class, since it is something nature can do, although the mode of nature is exceeded. Classifying the rapid movement of the boat on the surface of the sea depends on how it was propelled, but we will not go into that here. Miracles manifest divine power. Christ performs them with his divine power, but cannot do so according to his human power. Nevertheless, in order to confirm a teaching's credibility, God grants some human beings the grace or charism to perform miracles, not by their own power, but as an instrument. Not through a quality that abides in them, but by using the interior movement of man, or his words, or also some exterior act, or also some bodily contact. This is St. Thomas in Secunda Secundae, 178. Now, this grace, I'm quoting now from Tertia Pars, question 13, this grace was bestowed on Christ's soul most excellently, that is, not only that he might work miracles, but also that he might infuse this grace in others. As he does elsewhere, notably when the woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years touched him, Jesus here manifests that his humanity is a reliable instrument of this divine power, which has physical and visible effects. This serves to reveal a more perfect instrumentality which Christ's humanity has with regard to grace. To be clear, the instrumental causality of Jesus' humanity is rendered visible to his disciples by walking on the Sea of Galilee, so that they also believe in his instrumental causality regarding the invisible effects of grace in their souls. Even though the principal cause is solely the divine nature, what is caused is something found habitually in Christ, grace. In other words, his humanity is an instrument of the communication of a grace that is modeled after his own and participates in his own. Here, just as a sacrament causes what it shows, Christ's humanity affects the grace of which he is an exemplar. Thus, when Peter walks miraculously on water, he receives this transient bodily perfection so as to manifest that he is also receiving the gift of faith from Christ's humanity, invisibly. And when Jesus walks on water, all the disciples are confirmed in their own faith. By revealing that he could walk on water by willing it as man, Jesus revealed the instrumental causality of his humanity. In addition to involving a twofold illumination, twofold exemplarity, and instrumental causality, all of Christ's actions and experiences during his time as a wayfarer among us also caused our salvation meritoriously because of his ever actual charity and because of other conditions, namely that he did not possess wholly the ultimate reward. The aim of his will is to obey God's will, give him glory, and lead others to do the same, something he is successful in doing at the end of Matthew's pericope, as the end of Matthew's pericope shows. And finally, although for St. Thomas Christ does not redeem, atone, or offer sacrifice before his passion, the walking on the Sea of Galilee can be said to prefigure and prepare these soteriological causalities. Jesus himself compares his mission to that of Jonah. In order to save those who were on the boat on the Mediterranean Sea from a life-threatening storm, Jonah is willingly cast into the sea. An ensuing calm prompts the sailors to adore the true God. Even though Jesus is not thrown into the sea, his seaborne presence outside the boat still exposes him to the dangers of water, night, and wind. And his return to the boat brings calm and a manifestation of a trait of our future glorification and the life-giving knowledge that he is both God and man. Thank you.